Yep, I'm doing this. Caden.
And I got Botox Cosmetic. There was a particular photograph. The lines were...
Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel where I talk about weapons. In this video, we're going to talk about something explosive, under-barrel grenade launchers. I'll tell you how they first appeared, how effective they can be in combat, and also reveal some of their downsides. And of course, we'll answer the question everyone's been dying to know, which is cooler, the M16 or the AK grenade launcher? So grab some popcorn and watch till the end, and don't forget to give us a like. I bet you're curious to know why the first under-barrel grenade launchers came to be, right? Well, back in World War I, the military noticed something strange. There was a dead zone between the farthest distance a soldier could throw a grenade, around 50 meters or 150 feet, and the closest distance a mortar could fire, about 150 meters or 500 feet. And you know what that means? The poor infantry had with their trusty old machine guns. Can you imagine? It was a real problem. In fact, some soldiers had to risk their lives to get up close and personal with the enemy under a hail of bullets and explosions just to get close enough to toss a grenade. That's some serious bravery right there. The earliest precursor to the under-barrel grenade launchers were rifle grenades, which were already being used in muzzle-loaded grenade launchers during World War I. For example, the Germans actively used some weird-looking attachment which could be mounted on the Mauser 98K carbine, as well as many other rifles of that time. To launch grenades, blank cartridges were used, sometimes with an increased charge of gunpowder. But the catch was that these were essentially over-barrel grenade launchers, as they were attached directly to the barrel of the weapon. And the main drawback of rifle grenades was the inability to shoot the weapon normally without first removing the attachment or firing the grenade. In World War II, the Germans came up with their own handheld grenade launchers called the Kampfpistole, which looked like a pistol and fired various types of grenades. Then, during the Vietnam War, the Americans joined in with their M79. But back in the late 60s, the US Army was like, hey, we need an under-barrel grenade launcher for our brand new M16 assault rifle. So they hooked up with a company called AAI to make it happen. The first batch of grenade launchers, the M203, was shipped off to Vietnam for testing in 1970. And the Army loved them so much, they ordered a whole bunch more. The icing on the cake, the order was eventually snagged by Colt, a total legend in the gun world. Now, let's get down to business and talk about how these things actually work. Ready for this? It's super simple. Take the M203 for example. All you've got is a barrel to load a special grenade, a firing pin that hits the cap of the grenade, and a trigger with a safety catch. That's it. Pull the trigger and boom! The grenade flies out and makes the enemy wish they were somewhere else. But the real heart of the under-barrel grenade launcher is the grenade it fires, and the M203 uses 40 by 46mm grenade rounds. There are a ton of different types of grenades too. For example, there's the M397, which upon landing fires a grenade up in the air before exploding. And then there are non-lethal options like flashbang grenades.
Flashbang nades.
Tear gas is also a popular choice for dispersing riots and other large crowds. The under-barrel grenade launcher game. On the US side, it was the M203, while on the Russian side, it was the GP25 that could be mounted on any Kalashnikov assault rifle. The first Russian-made under-barrel grenade launcher was in 1978.
Position with my blanket.
And other Russian-made guns. Later modifications included the GP30 and the GP39, which are still used by many military units today. The GP25.
My God, it's only one?
25 grenades, which, like the American grenades, come in a bunch of different variations. For example, there's the Volk 25P, which spits out an explosive charge in the air before detonating upon contact with the surface. There are also various types of smoke grenades, like the Beats 1.5 kilograms, which is 3 pounds versus 3.3 pounds respectively. The barrel length of the M203 is also longer, almost 3 times longer, meaning that in theory it would shoot 3 times farther, measuring almost 30 centimeters compared to the GP25's 12 centimeters, which is 11 inches versus 5 inches. But then the magic begins, and you'll understand why. Grenade caliber, the same, at 40 millimeters. The rate of fire is almost identical for both the M203 and the GP25, at about 6 shots per minute. And the initial velocity of the projectile is the same too. Well, at least the maximum range of the projectile should be at least 2 to 3 times farther for the M203 than for the GP25, given that how did this happen? Well, it seems that the Russian guys came up with grenades for under-barrel grenade launchers that are way cooler than the Americans, and that's a fact. To give you an idea, in 1978, comparative tests were conducted with the GP25 grenade launcher firing Volt 25 grenades and the 40mm under-barrel grenade launcher M203 firing M406 rounds installed on the M1.
Good thing the general gives you a break when you need it. Yeah, with flexible payment options to keep you covered. So today,
16A1 rifle. So the results are in, and it turns out the Soviet-made GP25 grenade launcher with its Volt 25 rounds is a winner over the American-made M203 with its M406 rounds. During tests, the Volt 25 rounds were found to be 3 to 4 times more accurate than the M406 rounds, hitting targets more frequently in a tactical field that simulated live enemy forces. And even at range, the Volt rounds proved to be more effective. So, as it turns out, when it comes to grenade launchers and ammo, the Soviets had a trick up their sleeve, and it looks like they won this battle. And now let's talk about the downsides of using an under-barrel grenade launcher,
Heavy.
and why some of the soldiers might even hate to use it. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, folks. Sure, it's cool to attach one to your rifle and blow stuff up, but there are some drawbacks to consider. First of all, let's talk about the extra weight. Adding a grenade launcher to your rifle makes it around 50% heavier, which can be pretty tiring to carry around during long battles, so don't expect to see every soldier rocking a grenade launcher in real life. And if you're using the American M203, it's also pretty long and bulky, which can make it difficult to move around in tight spaces or even get in and out of vehicles. Plus, some soldiers have complained that the M203 is loud and clunky. This is due to the ring on which the weapon strap is attached, which constantly hits the grenade launcher, making unpleasant sounds when walking and hindering you from quietly sneaking up on the enemy. And sometimes the launcher can even fall off your gun after a few shots, which is definitely not ideal in combat. So while grenade launchers are a cool addition to your arsenal,
Yeah, I guess.
they're not always the best choice for every situation, just something to keep in mind. Now, let's talk about video games and how they portray under-barrel grenade launchers. If we start with the American M203, it's no surprise that it appears in the Call of Duty series. Specifically, let's look at the multiplayer mode in Warzone, where you can attach the M203 to various weapons. In the game, the grenade launcher shoots pretty far, unlike in previous versions of the game. It also has decent damage, but it may not always be enough to kill an enemy with one shot, unlike in real life, where a direct hit from a fragmentation grenade is usually fatal. Unfortunately, in Warzone, you can't choose the type of ammunition for the M203, and it always shoots fragmentation grenades, whereas in real life, these types of launchers are primarily used for smoke and flashbang grenades.
Yeah, you can.
Let's talk about the Russian GP25 and how it's portrayed in Escape from Tarkov. The game features the newer version of the GP34 with an extended barrel, just like in real life. You can attach the GP34 to almost all AK series rifles in the game, just like in real life. However, the game only includes one type of grenade for the launcher, the Volt 25, even though there are many different types of grenades available in real life, such as smoke and flashbangs. We hope the game developers add more options for grenade types in the future. As for the range in the game, there's nothing wrong with it. The underbarrel launcher can shoot up to 400 meters just like in real life. But the situation with damage is not entirely clear. Sometimes it explodes the enemy with the first shot, and sometimes it doesn't. Whereas in reality, a single VOG grenade can bring down an entire wall. So, Tarkov surprised us unpleasantly this time. Have you encountered these underbarrel?
Okay. That's better. Cave exploring gone wrong.
Killing men. Estrogen is the primary female hormone that's stimulated by the brain into production that.
Welcome to Scary Interesting, and welcome to some of the most horrifying caving incidents I've covered on this channel so far. This includes the deepest cave on Earth, the infamous Nutty Putty Cave incident, and much, much more. As a word of caution, if you're new here, these stories are anxiety-inducing, so viewer discretion is advised.
Scary interesting. Oh my god, I remember watching this guy a few months ago.
Vorovkina Cave. At 7,257 feet deep, Vorovkina Cave is the deepest cave on Earth. The cave is so deep that it takes over 4 days and thousands of feet of rope to descend to its immense depth. And certainly, what would the deepest cave be without a couple of horrifying incidents? These are those stories. On the border of Russia and Georgia is a mountain range known as the Caucasus Mountains. This mountain range is notable for a few reasons. First, it's home to Europe's highest peak, Mount Elbrus, at 18,500 feet. Then, on the western side of the region of Abkhazia is a sub-range of the Caucasus Mountains, known as the Gagra Range. There are some decent-sized mountains in this area as well. The highest among them is just over 11,000 feet. But this area is notable for another reason. The Gagra Range is primarily a limestone mountain range carved out by rivers over its geological history. The prehistoric rivers created a bunch of deep canyons, and the largest caves on Earth that are currently known. In fact, the Gagra Mountains are home to 4 of the deepest caves anywhere on Earth, and the deepest of these is Vorovkina Cave at over 7,000 feet deep. For context, that's the same as stacking 23 Statue of Liberties on top of one another.
Christ.
The entrance to Vorovkina Cave is also located at an altitude of 7,500 feet, meaning that you have to climb up a literal mountain to get to it. Once you're up there, you're still surrounded by the rocky cliffs of the mountain ranges, and then in the middle of these cliffs is a fairly underwater hole in the ground. It's obvious that it's the entrance to a cave, but you never expect it to descend for over a mile into the earth. When the entrance was first discovered in 1968 by a group of cavers, they only descended down to a depth of 377 feet before returning to the surface. Then in 1983, the cave was discovered for a second time by a separate team of speleologists from the Parago Speleal Club from Moscow. Over the next 3 years, a series of expeditions pushed the depth to around 1,400 feet, but then for reasons that are unclear, there were no more expeditions until the year 2000. Work resumed again that year, but it would take all the way until 2015 to discover a new shaft that would unlock the true depth of Vorovkina Cave. By 2017, they had extended the maximum depth of the cave from 1,400 feet all the way to 7,200 feet and mapped over 17 kilometers of tunnels and passages. Then finally, in March of 2018, the official deepest point of the cave was discovered at the bottom of a subterranean lake where the cave meets the water table, giving Vorovkina Cave a total depth of 7,257 feet. or 2,212
My God, I wonder how all that got carved out.
6 months later in September, the Parevo team returned once again to continue exploring the cave, and this time they were joined by photographers Robbie Stone and Jeff Wade. It was this same team of world-class cavers from the Parevo Club that made all of the sounding descents of Ralphkina and of the other deep caves in the Gabbro mountain range. Led by team leader Pavel Demidov, this expedition would be returning to the bottom of Ralphkina Cave to collect samples of some of the potentially undiscovered species and explore some of the promising horizontal passages at the bottom of the cave, all while having Robbie and Jeff document the entire thing. Now, in an ordinary cave of moderate depth, where you can descend and ascend in a single day, you'd still be bringing a decent amount of equipment because you need food and a bunch of climbing gear for every single person on the team. In caves as large as Ralphkina Cave, the descent is more similar to an expedition that you'd expect to see when climbing a tall mountain. If you've ever watched anything related to Mount Everest, you may have heard of the multi-camp system. These camps are established higher and higher up the mountain to store food and gear and for the climbers to sleep and stay in between climbing. For multi-day expeditions up a mountain or in a deep enough cave, the amount of gear becomes way too much to transport at a single time. People have to climb up and down in advance to transport load after load of the necessary equipment to ensure a safe attempt. And Ralphkina Cave is no different. In fact, because of how deep it is, it has a total of 6 camps at various depths on the way to the bottom. From the entrance, climbers have to put on special clothing, harnesses, and helmets fixed with headlamps. They then descend down the first shaft into the darkness and move through a series of tight tunnels and passages to reach the first camp at 2,000 feet. This camp is a permanently installed camp where gear and equipment are stored year-round for emergencies. Then, over the course of the next 4 days, Robbie, Jeff, and the Parevo's Field Club made their way to Camp 6, all the way down at 6,900 feet. On their way, the temperature was just a few degrees above freezing. They crawled through mud and water, impossibly tight squeezes, and descended down 100-foot shafts over nothing but air.
My
The
God.
thousands of feet of ropes that they used to make the descent were their only means of transportation in and out. Then, finally, they set foot onto the flat, sandy Camp 6 set up in a large horizontal tunnel. This would be their home for the remainder of the expedition. Over the next 3 days, the team set out from their camp to complete all of the tasks they had intended. One of these was to bring Robbie and Jeff to the lake that sits at the bottom. When they got there, they were stunned to see this beautiful turquoise water surrounded by jet black limestone. The lake is 50 feet long, 25 feet wide, and is actually 28 feet deep. If not for the lights they brought, it would sit there in complete darkness, entirely without color. On day 7, everything was still going according to plan, and that day, 2 of the members of the team had to leave early to catch a flight home. When they got up to Camp 3, there was a ton of water pouring into the cave. A massive storm up on the surface had caused a flood pulse to send thousands of liters of water rushing in. Inside these caves, you can't really communicate wirelessly because of the thick layers of rock, so instead, cavers have to run a physical line the entire length of the cave to communicate. The 2 team members immediately tapped to the cable to warn the others about the flood pulse headed their way. Down at Camp 6, they weren't all that worried when they initially got the call. Flood pulses are a common thing that cavers have to worry about. A single milliliter of rain is 1 liter per square meter, meaning that a single square kilometer receives 1,000 liters of water if just a single milliliter of rain falls. In heavy rain, that number is significantly higher. All of this water then bursts down into caves in equally huge volumes and can last for hours, depending on the volume of rain and how long it rains for. Again, they weren't all that worried when they first got the call. The Parevo group is world class, and their plan was to monitor the water level and then plan accordingly. Camp 6 had also been set up off of the main vertical shaft in what looked to be an area away from the flow of water. It was also at 6,900 feet, whereas the total depth was over 7,200 feet. For the water to reach them, it would have to fill up 300 feet of passages below them before it would reach them. About half an hour after they received the call, they heard the first sound of water approaching. It started off as a faint rumble and slowly grew like a train approaching. By the time they were just about to reach camp, it was so roaring loud that it was almost deafening. The entire cave shook like a constant earthquake was going on. Robbie had just started breakfast when the noise really started, and he and the others rushed out of their tents to see the approaching storm. As they turned their headlights towards the vertical shaft, a fire hose of water came pouring down. Robbie stood there with his mouth open and almost dropped the food he was holding. Not nearly as experienced as the Parevo team, Robbie Robbie was really concerned by the volume and speed of the water rushing in. But again, the spot they were in was completely dry, so he tried to stay calm with his Russian comrades. About 2 hours into the flooding, with no signs of it slowing, one of the team members noticed a gurgling sound coming from a small hole near the tent. He looked into the hole and couldn't see any water, but he figured he should tell the team leader anyway. Pavel agreed that this was a bit concerning, so they decided to go and check out a nearby siphon to see how much the water table had risen. They returned about 5 minutes later and looked into the hole once again. This time, not only could they see water, but it was rising so fast it was sloshing up around against the walls and almost out of the hole. The team member looked back at Robbie, and Robbie saw that his face had gone completely white. Immediately, he knew that this meant that they needed to leave, and leave right away. With the sound of water still almost deafening, all hell broke loose in the camp. No one expected to be leaving that day, but now everyone was running around packing up essential gear. Robbie and Jeff pulled on their latex suits over their fleece base layer. After that, they slipped on their abrasion-resistant nylon shells and harnesses. Robbie then made the tough decision to leave all of his camera equipment and personal items. Literally tens of thousands of dollars of equipment. He knew he couldn't risk being slowed down, or it could cost him his life or the life of one of his teammates. He pulled all of the memory cards out of the cameras, placed them in a Ziploc bag, and then
So
slipped
thank
them
God
in the
he
pictures.
actually saved the camera.
At the very least, he could save all of the pictures.
All the photos, yeah.
With that, he called out to the others that he and Jeff would start their ascent, and then they started off to the vertical shaft out of the quickly flooding Camp 6. This would be the last interaction they would have with the Russians at Camp 6. The remaining members of the Prevo team would wait for the team leader Pavel before starting their ascent. As Robbie and Jeff made their way to the vertical ropes, they reached a narrow traverse, almost like a bridge that went along one wall. Prior to the flooding, the chamber beside the bridge was 60 feet deep and 25 feet wide of nothing but air. Now it was almost completely flooded, almost coming up over the side of the bridge. At the end of this narrow traverse were the vertical ropes and the source of the water pouring into the cave. Robbie stepped into the waterfall pouring down from the shaft and clipped his ascenders to the rope. Then he put his head down, took a deep breath, and started making his way up the rope as the water pummeled him from above.
Hello?
Hello?
Yeah, is White over there?
No.
I don't know where it is.
Uh-oh.
You wanna come over?
I might actually go swimming here in a few hours.
Where?
Metamora Pool. Remember that? Or not Metamora, El Paso.
Can I come over? Actually, I don't know if I want to come over. I just don't want to, mess with this girlfriend over. And, it's a little awkward.
Yeah. I'll let you go.
Where are you coming? What are we doing?
I'm just sitting over at my house, just hanging.
If Wyatt comes over, tell me, because I don't know where he went.
Oh, okay. Bye.
Bye.
There's these like special type of houses that people construct that hang over hills. I'm gonna do that, but I might hang a few homes over here.
The water was coming down so hard it felt like it was crushing and suffocating him. It was literally as if his head was being squashed into his shoulders. Thankfully, he was able to tuck his chin, which allowed the water to run off of his helmet and create a small air pocket for him to breathe. Focusing on just the white rope directly in front of his face, he moved his ascenders up rhythmically as fast as he could. Finally, he reached an area with a small outcropping that he could step on and out of the waterfall to look up. He saw that the rope was coming out of a shoulder-sized hole in the rocks, but this was also the source of the water. Coming out of this little hole was a fire hose of water that seemed to take up the entire space of the lead climber. Everyone else was coming up behind him, and there was no telling what the water was like down below. He had to at least try to make it through. When he got to the hole, the force of the water was so strong that he was only able to push his ascenders a couple inches at a time. He finally made it through the squeeze, and then realized that Jeff would have to do the same thing. He had no idea whether or not Jeff would be able to make it, so he just kept climbing as high as he could to get out of the way. In his panic, he hadn't realized that this new section of the cave was mostly dry. The water flowed down a different route to the squeeze, so he was relatively safe where he was. But because he was so full of adrenaline, he was mindlessly climbing for his life as fast and as high as he could. only finally realized what he was doing when Jeff yelled out to him to slow down. Snapping out of it, he stopped and waited for Jeff to catch up before they continued. When Jeff reached him, his face was white, his eyes were wide, but he exclaimed that there was no reason why.
Stop drifting,
Two of them silently
jeez.
wondered if the same could be said for the Prevost team down below. Robbie and Jeff eventually made it up to Camp 5 at 6,200 feet, where they waited, hoping they would see the Russians any minute. As the cave continued to shake around them, they occasionally looked down over the edge into the abyss. Miraculously, down below they saw a single headlamp slowly making its way up the shaft. When he was finally close enough, they realized it was Andre. After he climbed up into camp, they asked him if he had seen the others, and he just shook his head silently. They all sat there, thinking about the worst-case scenario. Down below, by the time Pavel had returned from the siphon, the bridge that Robbie and Jeff had walked across was completely submerged. The rest of the team members had to actually swim to reach the vertical ropes. The last to swim out was Pavel, and as he was making his way out, the chamber had become a swirling vortex. All of the water draining deeper into the cave had turned into a giant whirlpool. When he went through it, it spun him around and he had to swim hard to make it to the line. By the time they were ascending, all of the deeper passages were completely submerged in water. Then, 15 minutes after Andre emerged, 5 more lights could be seen making their way up the shaft. One by one, all of the remaining members of the Prevost team made their way up to Camp 5. Robbie watched them ascend out of the flooded passage and couldn't believe how strong and capable they were. One team member was even carrying a stove and 4 sleeping bags attached to his harness. He thought to himself how glad he was that it was him and Jeff that had gone first. If they had been the ones to climb up last, it's likely they wouldn't have survived. And then when they climbed up into camp, they were quickly in the tent, having coffee and laughing about the entire ordeal. Robbie, on the other hand, was still thoroughly freaked out. For hours, he refused to take off his gear and kept looking down into the chasm to see if the water was still rising. 200 feet above them was a horizontal passage that continued to pass higher into the cave. Normally, it's already half filled with water, and you have to crawl through it. With all of the flooding, it was completely filled with water. As long as the flooding continued, they were trapped and just had to hope that the water didn't continue to rise higher. Pavel reassured Robbie that they would wait until morning to let the water clear, and then over the course of the next 16 hours at camp, the roaring of the water slowly died down. The flood pulse ultimately lasted a total of 20 hours and was the result of a week of rain, followed by a single severe storm. The week of rain had completely saturated the ground, so by the time the storm happened, the water poured relentlessly into Verovkina Cave. They later learned from a cab driver that the raindrops from the storm had been the size of nickels. This was actually
Oh my
a learning
God.
experience for the team. They had previously been operating under the assumption that the cave only flooded in the wintertime. Following the expedition, plans were put in place to improve the surface monitoring to watch for rain. Another camp was installed in the lower chamber to provide another escape point in the event of flooding. And despite this expedition being cut short, they had completed essentially everything they had set out to do. New passages had been explored and mapped, cave species had been sampled, and although the camera equipment was destroyed, all of the pictures were preserved. But this wouldn't be the last accident to ever occur in the Verovkina Cave. 2 years later, in November of 2020, some people exploring the area noticed a rope affixed to the cave's entrance. This is typically a big no-no in the caving world, because then anyone can access the cave and potentially get hurt or lost if they're unprepared. 8 months later, on August 4th, 2021, the same Prevost team returned to continue their work in Verovkina Cave. They descended into the cave as they had 3 years earlier, but then at 1,300 feet, they found a pair of crampons and an ice axe. This didn't make sense. This equipment couldn't have just fallen into the cave from the entrance. There were no straight drops to where the equipment was found. This meant that someone had to have come into the cave and deep into the cave. They continued further in, all the way to the permanent camp at 2,000 feet, then to the second camp at 3,200 feet, and then all the way at 3,600 feet. Halfway into the deepest cave on Earth, they found the badly decomposed body of a man. He was wearing camouflage overalls, trekking boots, a helmet, he had 2 cell phones, and he was still attached to the rope that he had used to descend into the cave. By the looks of the decomposition, he had been there for months. Although he had no ID on him when he was found, authorities were able to identify the man as 37-year-old Sergei Kozyev using a missing persons database. Then, using the information from the cell phones found on him, they were able to figure out what had happened that led to his death. Sergei lived in the city of Sochi, Russia, just east of the Russian border with Georgia, and about 2 hours from the entrance to Vorovkina Cave. He was an avid outdoorsman and frequently went on solo expeditions to explore the wilderness. On November 1st, 2020, he said goodbye to his family, as he always did when he was going on these solo expeditions, and then set off for the Gagara Mountains. He also didn't tell them where he was going, despite the fact that he was heading to a location that fewer people had set foot in than the International Space Station. Based on the documents and screenshots found on his phone, it seems that Sergei had spent almost a year planning his trip. He had printed out maps and materials from the expeditions made by the Parago team, specifically to navigate down into the cave. First, he made the ascent up into the mountains to the cave entrance using his crampons and ice axe. Then he fixed a rope to the opening and descended down into the darkness of Vorovkina Cave. Using the information that he had gathered from the Parago team, he hauled all of his equipment in 3 transport bags through the tunnels and narrow passages. Then, using a lattice descender, he traveled down the massive vertical shafts all alone. He successfully made it to the first camp and then left some of the equipment later discovered by the Parago team, and then proceeded almost directly to the second camp. It was determined by the excrement found on site that he lived at the second camp for about a week before descending further into the cave. From the second camp, things got a bit more challenging. Beyond that camp, there are some larger and more technically challenging vertical shafts. In addition, the cave becomes significantly wetter from that point onward. As any caver knows, proper equipment is crucial. The standard fleece underlayer with a waterproof outer layer is crucial to survive in the cold and wet subterranean environment. It's unclear exactly what happened in Sergei's last moment, but it seems as though he realized that he wouldn't be able to descend any further through the water with the equipment he had. At which point, he would have tried to make his way back up the cave, but because he had already descended into a technically challenging area, he was unable to get back out. Sergei had brought ascenders for his hands, but he didn't have any stirrups for his feet, meaning that he had no footholds for any of the long vertical shafts. He must have tried and tried to make his way out of the cave, but between the exhaustion and the cold, he eventually laid down to sleep one last time and never woke up. Upon finding his body, the Parago team went back up to the surface and alerted authorities. Due to the difficulty of the cave and the depth that Sergei's body was found at, it would take a team of over 100 individuals to eventually retrieve it. It's also particularly risky to be in a confined space like a cave with a decomposing body, because the gases given off from the decomposition process can build up and become toxic at high enough levels. Despite how many people were involved in the rescue, they still ended up having to cut Sergei into pieces to successfully remove him from the cave. After his retrieval, his body was finally returned to his wife and kids in Sochi. For now, Vorovkina Cave is the deepest cave on Earth. But the Earth is a big place, and caves are not nearly as readily viewable as their mountain counterparts. Vorovkina Cave was only crowned the deepest in 2018. It remains to be seen whether it will hold its place as the deepest on Earth.
Cascade
Six
Cave.
men were exploring the 300-foot deep Cascade Cave on Vancouver Island when something went horrifyingly wrong. This is their story. On the west coast of British Columbia, Canada, is the beautiful Vancouver Island. Home to the province's capital, Victoria, Vancouver Island is the largest and most populated island along the west coast of the Americas. Vancouver Island also has a diverse climate with some of the mildest temperatures anywhere in Canada. The temperature in January rarely drops below freezing, and the summer temperatures can reach as high as 33 degrees Celsius or 91 Fahrenheit on a regular basis. The interior of the island also has significant mountains, similar to those that are typical of the rest of the Pacific Northwest. As a result, there are large differences in the amount of precipitation across the island. The interior of the island can see as much as 262 inches, which is the most in all of North America, whereas the eastern tip in the rain-shadowed mountains sees as little as 24 inches. In addition, the majority of this precipitates during the winter months. In fact, the rainfall during the summer season amounts to less than 1/5 of the rain during the winter season. And if you've ever been to the Pacific Northwest, you're probably all too familiar with the rainy months. At 6 a.m. on December 5th, 2015, Jason Story bent down in the dark over his bed to kiss his wife Caroline goodbye. That day, he would be traveling 80 miles northwest of his home in the city of Duncan on Vancouver Island to explore a cave with 5 friends. He walked out of his house that morning, and the rain was coming down steadily, as is the case with most days in the winter months of the Pacific Northwest. Jason was dressed for the wet weather, though, not only for the trip there, but also for the conditions inside the cave. He had some rubber boots, neoprene socks, 3 shirts, overalls, and a water-resistant jacket. He'd also recently bought a helmet with a mounted headlight for just this occasion. Up to this point, Jason had only been caving 4 times, and the cave that he was going to that day was going to be his toughest cave yet. Near the city of Port Alberni is a cave known as Cascade Cave. It's dangerous enough that there's a locked hatch covering the opening, and the key to the hatch is only given to groups that sign waivers indicating that they understand the dangers of exploring the cave system.
Okay.
In addition, the location of the cave is kept somewhat secret.
Yeah, if your mom lets you go swimming, yeah.
Or disturb the formations inside of it. The interior of the Cascade Cave is about a mile long and descends to 338 feet under the Earth's surface. It's also filled with impossibly tight and winding tunnels that are just barely passable by an adult person. After leaving his house that morning, Jason met up with his friends Andrew and Adam, who were paramedics, and Zach, who was a chef and volunteer firefighter. Together, they drove into Port Alberni, where they picked up the key to the hatch and met up with 2 more friends, Matt and Taylor, who were both computer programmers. Jason was the oldest of the group by about a decade at 43 years old, and the least experienced caver among them. It was his friend Andrew who introduced him to the sport, and if there was anyone you'd want to be your teacher, it was Andrew. Not only was he an expert caver and former cave guide, he had a wiry frame perfect for caving. His job as a paramedic also made him invaluable if anything went wrong during their descent. From Port Alberni, they drove up a forested, unmarked trail for about half a mile before parking in a small clearing. After parking, they took inventory of all their climbing gear, which included ropes, harnesses, carabiners, and a small ladder they would use to descend into the opening of the cave. They also brought a small gas stove, food, water, and a first aid kit containing a Mylar space blanket. If you've never seen one of these before, they look almost like a blanket made out of aluminum foil, and they're excellent at preventing heat from escaping. After checking their gear, they set off into the forest to find the entrance to Cascade Cave. Specifically looking for it, which is incredible considering what it leads to. They got to the hatch at about 10 a.m. and reached into the small hole beside it with a key to open the lock. Next, they fixed their aluminum ladder to 2 carabiners near the opening and then fixed ropes to their harnesses to blaze one another down the ladder. All of them descended into the cave, and then the last person in closed the hatch and locked it once again. With it closed, the last little bit of light filtering into the cave was now gone. The key was then tied to the bottom of the ladder because if it got lost, there would be no way for them to reopen the hatch and exit the cave. From the surface, the cave descends 30 feet straight down into the first chamber. Now relying on their headlamps, they took their first look around at the subterranean abyss that would be their home for the next few hours. It was damp and cold, just barely above freezing, but this is what they expected, so they started down the first narrow passageway from the first chamber. On either side were jagged boulders, and the ceiling was dripping with water from all of the moisture. As they continued deeper into the cave, the dripping water eventually turned into a small stream along the cave floor.
It eliminates the burden of scooping and leaves your cat with a clean bed of litter every...
First it was up to their ankles, and then up to their shins as they crouched through the narrow tunnels. At around 45 minutes in, Adam decided he couldn't go any further. He had tweaked his back a few weeks prior, and all of the bending was making it flare up. He said goodbye and good luck to everyone, and then Matt went with him back to the exit of the cave. Once he was out safely, Matt locked the hatch once again and rejoined the rest of them to continue.
Don't say anything exposing, please.
For the next hour and a half, they slowly made their way through the narrow passages, crawling and sliding. Inside the cave, the entire group was always within about 100 feet from the first person to last person, but most of the time they couldn't actually see one another because they were obscured by the rock. Mason was amazed by what he was seeing. There were over 1,000 caves and tunnels on Vancouver Island, and they're all completely unique. Eventually, they made it to the first feature that makes Cascade unique, which is an area known as Bastard's Crawl. This passageway is too narrow to be able to stand, so you have to crouch down and grab on.
Yeah, I'll check it. I will sometime. If I don't do it now, I will do it later.
So you don't slip down the rock. After exiting Bastard's Crawl, they reached the only major water.
Oh my god, that's like a birth canal squeeze from freaking Nutty Putty. Oh my god, I would never do that. Mm-mm.
The streams then fall.
If I have to squeeze myself into a cave entrance, that's not gonna happen. Mm-mm.
At the top of the waterfall,
I've seen the tale from Nutty Putty to know better than do that.
and slippery rocks into the chasm. The
Oh,
entire
never.
time, the water was just spraying down on either side as they tried to keep from slipping on the wet footholds. As Jason was going down, he could hardly believe how hard his heart was beating. He wanted a harder challenge though, and that's exactly what he was getting. After they all finally made it down, they walked a little ways away from the waterfall to regroup for some lunch. They also noticed that it seemed like the water coming down Double Trouble was getting stronger as time went on. Just before 1 p.m. and about 3 hours into the cave, they sat there using the little stove to heat up some beef stew. Although they were 200 feet underground in the light of just pet natives, this is exactly what they hoped the day would be. About 20 minutes later, they started moving again, and with only a quarter-mile left in the cave, they would be at the end in less than an hour. When they got about 300 feet where they ate lunch, Zach started shivering violently. After 3 hours in the cave, a short rest was just long enough for the cold to creep in. But because they were almost at the end anyway, they all decided that they would turn back together and head for the exit. The group retraced their route all the way to Double Trouble and noticed that the sound of the water was a lot louder, and visibly the streams were a lot larger. Matt started up the waterfall first, then Arthur would go, then Jason, Zach, and Andrew would come up from behind as the most experienced caver. There was also a lot more mud being washed out of the cave, and it was sticking to their feet as they walked. The climb up was always a lot slower than the climb down, and with how hard the water was coming down now, it was even more difficult to find a foothold on the rock. After Jason successfully made it up Double Trouble, he was wondering how the water had gotten so much stronger so quickly. He wondered how runoff from the rain could be adding so much to the flow of the streams. Beyond Double Trouble, Jason got on his stomach and started pulling himself up towards Bastard's Crawl, and the water was just pelting him in the face. When barely above freezing, the water was like ice, taking his breath away as he pulled himself through it. After making it past an outcropping, he started into another tight passage that split into two. He paused for a second, not remembering which way to go, and because he couldn't see anything up ahead, he decided that it would be best to climb back down and ask. As he climbed back down about 15 feet, the water suddenly surged and swept his feet out from under him and knocked him onto his back, completely submerging him in the stream. He quickly tried to stand up, but because of the way that the water was flowing, it was sucking him down, and his body was acting like a cork in the passageway. He could barely keep his head out of the water, and the pressure was building around him. If he didn't get out quickly, the water would shoot him out the passage and over Double Trouble, 50 feet down to the rocks below. He tried to move, but his boot was jammed, and the freezing water washing over him was making him extremely cold and quickly draining all of his strength. Lying on his back, he realized he needed to call for help, but when he did, water just flowed into his mouth, causing him to choke and gasp for air. After 5 minutes of struggling with the freezing water, thinking about his wife and kids, he managed to get out and got a cry for help. Zach and Andrew finally caught up and realized that Jason was in serious trouble. Andrew jumped into action and rushed over to where Jason was stuck. When he got there, he could barely see Jason's face above the stream of water. He yelled to him to keep his head above the water and started trying to pull him out. Between the tight space and the rushing water, it was incredibly difficult to get his leverage. Jason was also so weak at this point, the water was so loud, he could barely communicate with Andrew. So Andrew started shouting specific instructions at Jason, guiding his hands and feet to stay in position so that he could help to pull him out. When he started pulling him out, though, the water washed over Jason's head and forced him back into the recess once again. They started the process over, with Andrew shouting specific positions and Jason struggled through the torrent. Eventually, Andrew managed to grab hold of his arm and whipped Jason out through the torrent of water. When Jason finally emerged, he was wide-eyed and gasping for air, barely able to get out any words. Although they were out of the worst of it, they were still almost submerged in the stream of water. Andrew encouraged Jason to keep moving, but he was in rough shape and wanted a moment to catch his breath. Andrew knew, though, that they needed to keep moving because every second spent in the water was another second closer to hypothermia, and the flow of water was still getting stronger by the second. Finally, Jason managed to pull his leg free, and they were able to move further into Bastard's Crawl. Once it was clear that Jason was safe, Andrew told Zach to stay with Jason while he went up ahead to grab their bags. About 15 minutes later, he returned with a supply bag containing a mylar blanket and immediately wrapped it around Jason. He told Zach that the water was way higher and rushing a lot faster, so he should go up and join the others and tell them what happened. If he and Jason weren't behind them, in 30 minutes they should leave the cave in order to search and rescue. He also knew that if for some reason he and Jason weren't able to exit that cave, there wasn't enough room for 3 people to stay. He then used the gas stove to heat up water and poured it down Jason's clothes to warm him up. Although he didn't have a thermometer to actually check, Andrew knew that Jason was likely stage 2 hypothermia. He was so cold he'd actually stopped shivering. All of the color had drained from his face. Thankfully, between the mylar blanket and the warm water, Jason slowly regained color and was eventually more than trying to get out of the cave. where they were, normal circumstances would be about an hour back to the clearing. But as they started climbing out, they would fight the rushing water.
Stupid controller.
The final section of Bastard's Crawl had just a 4-inch space between the water and the ceiling. This meant that they wouldn't be able to crawl through it to keep their head out of the water. With that, Andrew knew that they had to turn back and wait until conditions improved, while also hoping the water didn't fully submerge the cave. After climbing back down, they found a mostly dry ledge jutting out at a 45-degree angle with just enough room for both of them. The stream running through the cave sprayed the ledge on the outer edge, and so Andrew had Jason go on the other side to stay dry. Andrew then braced himself on the ledge as well and made himself comfortable for the long wait. Subterranean caves can have little microclimates different from the conditions on the surface. Inside Cascade, the torrent of water was moving so fast that it was actually bleeding on the ledge, and eventually the water was so high that it was just a few feet from where they were sitting. It was now 6 p.m. and they were still 200 feet underground, huddling together under the Mylar blanket. It had also already been 3 hours since Zach left, and they had no way of knowing whether or not their friends had made it out of the cave. It's possible that the rest of the cave had been blocked up by water, or someone else had gotten stuck or injured, or even worse.
Hey, it's a brown panda.
And no help was coming. Thankfully, though, the rest of the group did make it out of the cave, and after driving to an area with cell service, contacted search and rescue teams at 9 p.m. Rescuers immediately went to try to reach the barrel bed, but the water level was too high and moving too quickly. They would just have to hope that the water wasn't filling the cave entirely. The two men had found some sort of shelter deeper into the cave. Inside the cave, Jason and Andrew kept their headlamps off to conserve the batteries, so they sat there in complete darkness, wondering if anyone was coming to help them. Hours went by, and the water slowly crept higher and higher. They couldn't sleep because the 45-degree angle they were on would mean that if they didn't focus on keeping their footing, they would slip off the ledge and into the water. Throughout the night, they would check in with each other every 20 minutes or so, and then finally, at 5 a.m., the water looked as though it had started to recede. They waited just a little bit longer to make sure it was safe, and then made another attempt at exit. After sitting in the exact same position for 12 hours and without sleep, it was incredibly difficult to get moving again. Over the course of 90 minutes, crawling on all fours to wade through water up to their chest, they finally made it close enough to the exit to see lights off in the distance. They called out to the rescuers, and one rescuer called back, "I love you," in sheer relief at the sight of the men. After almost 24 hours trapped in Cascade Cave, they fixed their harnesses to the belay rope and slowly climbed the moving ladder towards the surface. In true Canadian fashion, Andrew greeted them with a cheers as he finally poked his head out of the 30-foot shaft. The following year, on May 7th, the group met the to Cascade Cave to retrieve some of their equipment and to get redemption for their failed attempt. They parked in the clearing once more and made their way to the steel hatch. Since their descent the year prior, no other groups had gone to the cave, so they had to brush up the dirt that was now covering the entrance. Andrew reached down and unlocked the hatch as he did the year before, the ground much drier than the last attempt. They fixed their harnesses with the rope and they moved the ladder once again, and Jason descended back into the cave that almost took his life. As they moved their way through the cave this time, the torrential stream from the year before was just a tiny trickle of water. Instead of wet, slippery rocks, they had rough, dry handholds, making it much easier to make their way through the cave this time. After the harrowing ordeal from the year before, the group successfully made it out of Cascade without incident.
Nutty Putty. Oh my god, this one is
John Jones
anxiety-inducing.
Nutty Putty Cave in Utah, but he got stuck upside down in a tunnel the size of a Dwyer's orb. Because of the angle he was stuck, blood began to pool in his brain, ensuring that he would die if he wasn't rescued soon. This is the story of John Jones and the Nutty Putty Cave disaster. John Edward Jones was born into a big family of 7 kids. As a kid, John and his brother Josh were introduced to spelunking or cave exploring by their father. During their childhood, they
Oh my god! Sorry.
their home state of Utah.
Oh, that's annoying.
Explore in the dark
I need to get a new controller.
John was now married and had a 1-year-old daughter.
Sorry there, I hate this controller. It's absolutely bad.
They were now living in Virginia, where he was attending medical school to become a pediatric cardiologist. That year for Thanksgiving, John went back home to spend time with his family, and they all decided it would be fun to explore the famous Nutty Putty Cave to celebrate and connect over the holiday. On November 24th,
Man, it happened on a holiday?
p.m., John and 10 other friends and family squeezed through the tight opening of Nutty Putty Cave. First explored in 1960 by caver Dale Reed, attracted 25,000 visitors a year and was famous for its narrow, slippery tunnels and particularly tight squeezes, formed by hydrothermal vents shaping their way through the limestone. Nutty Putty Cave is named after the putty-like brown clay that lines its walls. Hydrothermal caves, like Nutty Putty, are characterized by a series of large domes connected by narrow, twisting tunnels. And the different sections of Nutty Putty have names appropriate for their size, such as the Birth Canal, the Aorta, the Maze, and the Scout Eater. In total, Nutty Putty was surveyed to be 1,355 feet long and 145 feet deep underground. Nutty Putty Cave also has a bit of a tumultuous history. Due to its popularity, there had been excessive scooters of limestone rock in the cave, and it was predicted that a fatality would occur in one of those sections. In fact, in 2004, 5 years before John Jones entered the cave, the Boy Scouts nearly died in 2 separate incidents within a week of each other.
Yeah, give me a second.
Before we go, we have to check him over.
God, I hate Nutty Putty.
In one of those
This guy got
cases,
stuck
rescue
upside down.
hours to rescue
If you don't know why that's bad,
Scout from the cave
blood will
using
pool in your brain, and he eventually died. They almost got him out, but they slipped the cable, and he fell right back in, and they couldn't get him out in time, and he died.
Upon entering the cave, the group explored the large cave known as the Big Slide. After that, John, his brother Josh, and 2 friends decided to try to find a more challenging section they had heard of called the Birth Canal. The Birth Canal is a narrow squeeze that drops down and opens up into a larger room and looks as though you're being birthed as you come out of it, hence the name. John found a hole in the wall that he thought led to the birth canal and went in head first. He crawled along his stomach for some time and didn't see anywhere that the tunnel opened up any further. In fact, it narrowed as he crawled along. Now, it's not entirely clear exactly where John was in the cave at this point. Some sources think that he had correctly entered the birth canal, but then accidentally turned down another section known as Scout Eater, whereas other sources claim that he was in a tunnel beside the birth canal named Ed's Push. In either case, these tunnels don't lead anywhere large enough for a person and are unexplored as a result. Eventually, he came upon a sharp downturn in the tunnel that went nearly straight down.
Oh, fudge. People at Fudge Stripes, magic is here.
Maybe thinking that this was the drop that he was
Okay.
looking for in the birth 10 inches and 18 inches across. Before long, John realized he had made a huge mistake and the tunnel didn't open up at all. It narrowed even further and he was now stuck upside down. The first person to find John was his brother Josh, and when Josh got to his brother, he tried pulling him up and out of the tunnel, but was only able to move him just a little bit before John slipped out of his hands and slid right back into the crevice. When John slipped back in, he got wedged even further into the crevice, and this time, one of his hands was pinned underneath him, and the other was forced backward. The only thing sticking out of the crevice now were just John's feet and ankles. Realizing the severity of the situation, John and Josh said a quick prayer, and then Josh hurried out of the cave to get help. The first rescuer to arrive was a woman named Susie Matola, and by the time she got to John at 12:30 a.m., John had been trapped for 3 hours, 400 feet into the cave and 100 feet underground. Susie introduced herself to John's black running shoes that were the only thing visible in the tunnel, and John responded by saying, "Hi Susie, thanks for coming, but I really want to get out of here." Over the next few hours, dozens and dozens of rescuers arrived and worked to free John from the cave. They brainstormed different plans to free him and even discussed looping up the walls of the cave to slide him out. Eventually, they decided on a series of climbing cams. A rope would then be fed through the cams and attached to John's legs, and the rescuers would then pull on the other end of the rope and pull John up through the crevice. As they attached the cams, they also began drilling away at the chunks of rock to widen up the tunnel. Unfortunately, due to how narrow the passages were, the drilling was slow, and it would take over an hour for just a couple of inches of rock to be removed. Another thing complicating the rescue was the position of John's body. The ceiling above where John was stuck was so low that they couldn't just pull him straight up. They would need to pull him up a little bit, and then readjust, and then pull some more, and then readjust some more. The first attempt using just the climbing cams was unsuccessful, and so rescuers decided instead to feed the rope through pulleys that were bolted to the walls of the cave. Again, this was a painfully slow process because of how narrow the cave was, and although a team of almost 100 rescuers worked frantically to get John out of Nutty Buddy Cave, only a single person was able to access John at a time. Meanwhile, 19 hours into the rescue, John's condition was beginning to worsen. The human body is adapted to pumping blood into the brain against the force of gravity when we're upright. When we're upside down, blood pools in the brain and the heart is unable to work hard enough to pump blood out of the brain. This also causes the heart to work much harder as it tries to continuously pump blood out of the brain against the force of gravity. Eventually, the strain on the heart and the pooling in the brain is fatal. As time went by, John started to have difficulty breathing and was alternating back and forth between being calm and being panicked. Around this time as well, a two-way radio was brought into the cave and lowered down to John so John and his wife could talk to each other. Although they were both worried, they tried to comfort each other as best as they could. Finally, rescuers finished drilling the holes and attaching the pulleys into the walls of the cave. 8 men then grabbed one end of the rope and began inching John.
And then, as Hope
After
seemed
so
like
much time spent upside down, John's legs were in a lot of pain, and so the team had to stop frequently to give him breaks. But eventually, they did actually manage to pull him up high enough for one of the rescuers to make eye contact with him. He looked tired, his eyes were red, and he complained about the pain in his legs, but would actually smile at rescuers. After one final rest, the rescuers pulled John up once again, and he was almost out when all of a sudden the entire team fell backwards as the rope went loose in their hands. The closest rescuer was knocked unconscious when one of the pulleys broke free from the wall of the cave. When he came to, there was too much dust in the tunnel for him to see anything. When the dust settled, he saw that a large piece of rock that had rope tied around it had broken, causing the pulley to break free. At the same time, he realized that John had slid right back into the crevice. This time, it seemed as though he was even deeper than before. The rescuer had also suffered severe facial injuries from the impact and had to have someone come in and take his place. When the new rescuer arrived, he noticed that John's breathing was much more shallow and less frequent as John was now struggling to stay alive. The new rescuer desperately tried to drill a new hole for the pulley, but after exhausting himself, was replaced once again. Another new rescuer arrived, and the next replacement tried to talk to John, but couldn't get any response. Shortly after that, a medical professional crawled into the cave to where John was, and John was pronounced dead at midnight on November 25th, 2009.
that sucks.
The official cause of death was ruled to be cardiac arrest. During the rescue, a total of 137 rescuers worked continuously for 27
Sucks
hours,
they're so
but ultimately
close.
were unsuccessful in saving John Jones from the Nutty Buddy Cave. The following day, authorities determined that retrieving the body would be too dangerous,
And they
the
sealed it
bandage was
off.
poured over the entrance, and John's body has remained there ever since. Donald Cerrone was diving through Airlito Cave in Cozumel, Mexico, when something went horrifying wrong. This is his story. Donald Cerrone was born in Denver, Colorado on March 29, 1983. Growing up, Donald was considered a bit of a troubled child. As a teenager, he took up street fighting, and this would result in him often ending up spending the night in jail. When Donald was 16, his parents had had enough of his behavior and the fighting and sent him to live with his grandmother. His grandmother welcomed him with open arms and would even bail him out of jail after some of his street fights. The next morning, after she would bail him out, she would never bring up what happened the night before. She would simply say, "You know what you did," and then leave it at that. At the age of 20, Donald started kickboxing and then Muay Thai after that, and as it turned out, he was pretty good. After winning a few kickboxing competitions, he decided to pursue a career in MMA, also known as mixed martial arts, where he adopted the nickname Donald Cowboy Cerrone for his tendency to wear cowboy hats. He would win his first 9 fights in a row and was soon contending for championship fights in the WEC. After leaving the WEC, Donald signed with the insanely popular fight promotion company, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, also known as the UFC. As a fighter in the UFC, Donald rose to superstardom and became one of the largest drawing fighters in the promotion's history. In addition to fighting on the world stage in the largest fight promotion in the world, Donald is a bit of an adrenaline junkie, as are many of the individuals in that community. In his spare time outside of training and competing in the UFC, he competes and participates in all sorts of other high adrenaline pursuits like dirt biking, off-road racing, water skiing, and even bull riding. Another thing Donald really loves to do is scuba dive. After getting his certification in high school, he fell in love with all things diving. In his own words, he just loves diving. He loves shipwreck diving. He just loves everything about it. However, his favorite is cave diving. In August of 2018, Donald Cerrone was in Cozumel, Cozumel, Mexico, where he planned to go diving with a friend of his who we'll call Alex. For the first 3 or 4 days of their trip, they went diving to some shipwrecks and to some coral reefs with a few other friends of theirs. They also planned a slightly more serious dive for just the two of them at a cave known as Arolito Cave. In the old South Harbor of Cozumel, in an area known as Caleta, there is an unremarkable looking pond that is easy to get to and easy to access. Most divers and tourists pass by this pond and think nothing of it. However, this pond is actually very remarkable. In fact, it is actually named Cenote Arolito de Paraíso. A cenote is a natural pit or sinkhole that forms when the limestone underneath the surface collapses, revealing the groundwater underneath. Many of these cenotes actually lead to subterranean water bodies that can range from just small pools to massive and expansive cave systems. Cenote Arolito is unremarkable on the surface, but leads to one of these massive and expansive cave systems and connects to over 6 kilometers of mapped caves that exist below the surface of Cozumel. On August 17th, Donald kissed his wife and new baby goodbye before he was leaving to go meet up with Alex. Before he left, his wife told him that she was really uncomfortable with him going caving with Alex. The reason she was uncomfortable was that she was worried about Alex's capabilities as a diver. For many years, Alex and Donald had been caving together, and Alex was even sort of a mentor to Donald. But Alex was now getting older, and his motor skills had declined with age. His mind was still as sharp as ever, but his body just couldn't keep up. Donald reassured his wife that everything was going to be fine, and that he was going to come home after the dive, just like always. His wife was still worried though, and so as an extra precaution and to reassure her, Donald ordered an extra cylinder of air. Originally, he had planned to take 2 cylinders for the dive, and so now he would have 3 total. For their dive, as is typical in cave diving, they would be diving in thirds. This means that they were going to use a third of their air going in, a third coming out, and then they would have a third in reserve in case something unexpected happened. In cave diving as well, the first divers who discover and map out a cave will run long ropes called guidelines throughout the cave to help divers find their way in and out of the caves. This is because many of these caves are massive and winding, low visibility corridors that are just difficult to tell apart, making it easy to get lost if you're not familiar with the system. These guidelines are also marked with directional signals, known as cookies, that are clear and easy to read and point towards the exit of the cave. One of the leading causes of death in cave diving is when the guidelines are improperly used or improperly marked by the divers as they navigate the cave. These guidelines typically come in 2 different varieties. First are the fixed or main lines that are permanently installed in the cave system and eliminate the need for divers to install a large portion of the lines in a cave each time they dive. These can either start right at the exit or a bit into the cave to ensure that recreational divers don't find them and then enter the caves without proper training or equipment. Main lines are also not all connected, requiring that divers bring reels with them to connect from one to the other using lines known as jump lines. Jump lines are attached by divers as they move through a cave to connect from one main line to the next. Jump lines are also removed by divers as they exit a cave to help simplify the lines within the system. Donald and Alex entered Arolito Cave from the little unassuming pond on the surface. They then traveled along the various lines of the cave to explore the gorgeous and expansive system they had come to see. At some point, they needed to transition from one line to another. Alex went first and grabbed his light and hung it around his neck so that he could make the switch with 2 hands. As Alex went to tie off, his buoyancy device, which is a little device that fills with air to increase or decrease your buoyancy, got loose and shot up to the ceiling of the cave. He then kicked his feet, spun around, and when he did that, the guideline, their lifeline, wrapped itself around him. Donald immediately swam over to Alex to help him try to untangle the line, but Alex started panicking. He then started thrashing violently, spinning around, hitting the walls of the cave, and kicking up all of the silt from the bottom of the cave. Silt is the dust and sediment that sits at the bottom of the cave, and when it gets kicked up in the small spaces inside of a cave, it brings the visibility to almost 0. It's like swimming around in mist so thick that you can barely see the hand in front of your face. And Arolito Cave was now completely silted out. Knowing how dangerous this situation was, Donald took a few big steps backward away from Alex so he didn't get caught in the line either, and so he could regain visibility. Within arm's reach of the main line now, Donald watched helplessly as Alex thrashed around even more. One of the unspoken rules of cave diving, according to Donald, is that you only worry about yourself in a panicked situation. The idea is, the panicked person poses a threat to anyone trying to help, and there's no reason for 2 people to die if one person can still make it out. As he sat there, holding the main line, he looked towards the exit of the cave and knew that he was safe if he went that way. He knew where the exit was, he could easily swim to it, and be sure that he would get out alive. He also looked at the completely silted out section where Alex was and knew that Alex would almost certainly die without help. In the panic, Alex had somehow turned off his light, and Donald just sat there thinking that he hopes that he also didn't drop his mouthpiece, and that he wasn't drowning to death just a few feet away from him. Donald decided to break one of his unspoken rules and decided to go into the silt to try to save Alex. As soon as he entered the silt, he lost all sense of direction, he didn't know which way was up or down, and then he started to panic as well. All of a sudden, he was taking deep, fast, panic breaths, completely freaking out, more panicked than he's ever been in his entire life. In his panic, he smashed his head off of the ceiling of the cave and then closed his eyes. The hit to the head gave him a brief second of calm, and then he managed to tell himself to slow his breathing down. With his breathing slowed, barely able to see the hands in front of his face, he looked at his glowing watches that indicated his depth and time. He then checked the 2 pressure gauges on each of the cylinders he was using and knew that he had a third one that was completely full, still unopened. He then closed his eyes and sat there in the pitch black, silted out room, trying to think through the panic and figure out a plan. The first thing he did was try to feel around the silt and try to find Alex, but Alex was nowhere to be found. Thankfully, he had calmed himself down a little bit more, and then decided to start moving his hands along the wall of the cave to see if he could figure out where he was. Typically in good business, their way out. But the channel that they were in was one that they were on their way to explore. They weren't coming out of it, so it was entirely unfamiliar to him. He then decided to check his compass, because when they came into the cave, he had measured the direction of the exit from the first jump to be 126 degrees. This was a bit of a long shot, because in the winding tunnels of a cave, you can be facing the correct direction towards the exit, but if you're not in the right section of the cave, that direction might just lead to the wall of another tunnel. Without any other choice, he tried to swim in that
Why is
direction,
that bee
but
so far up?
immediately came up on a wall. He then tried to swim lower and went right into another wall, and now he was right back in full panic mode. So now he's kicking and thrashing and freaking out and swimming violently, and then all of a sudden, he exited the silt and stumbled on the main line. Donald grabbed it and tried to calm himself down once again, but there was a new problem. He was on the wrong side of the silted section of the main line. Behind him, deeper into the cave, was silt-free and clear. The way out of the cave, the way that he needed to go, was completely silted out still, and the exit was almost 1,000 yards away. In addition, there was a jump in between where he was and where he needed to be, meaning that he would have to find his way untethered through the silt to make it out of the cave. He sat there for a moment, thinking about the maps of the cave that he had scoured before they entered that day. He knew that up ahead there was a split in the cave. One side went to the exit, and the other went deeper in the cave. So, he re-entered the silt and started to feel around and managed to find a hole. Not sure if this was correct or not, he kept on going and came up on another hole. He felt around and thought that it felt familiar and decided to swim into it. But then he noticed that he was swimming against the current. When they had come into the cave, he also noticed that they were swimming against a small current, meaning that given that he was now traveling in the opposite direction, he was swimming in the wrong direction. Beginning to panic once again, he frantically swam back to the main line on the opposite side of the silt. Sitting there literally hyperventilating from panic, all he could think of that morning was when he kissed his wife and baby and assured them that he was coming home. So he swam back into the dark abyss of silt once again and panicked once again. And now, in the pitch-black darkness of the cave, he thought to himself, all of this heavy breathing is sucking all of the air out of my tanks. So in addition to being lost in the darkness, he started to worry about running out of air entirely. Trying to calm himself, he looked at his watch and then his gauges, and then back at his watch, and managed to figure out that he had roughly an hour left of air. He started to think about what would happen once he ran out of air. On the air-only system he was using, once he ran out, the mouthpiece would just fill with water, and then he would inhale the water, and he would drown. Ironically enough, one of Donald's biggest fears is drowning. So, not wanting to drown, he grabbed his buoyancy device and began breathing into it to fill it up completely. With it full, he shot up to the ceiling of the cave and was now resting upside down. At first, he sat there thinking about his wife and daughter and thought about grabbing his grease pen and notepad to write a letter to them about how he had messed up and how sorry he was. Then he thought about how terrified he was of drowning and decided that once he ran out of air, he would breathe from his buoyancy device until there was no more oxygen left in it. Once it was only expelled carbon dioxide, he would keep breathing until he slowly passed out, at which point he wouldn't be awake when he drowned. As he sat there thinking about writing the goodbye note and how he intended on just going to sleep in the darkness, he was infuriated with himself that he was giving up hope and succumbing to the situation. He thought to himself, I'm a fighter, that's not what fighters do, and so he began crawling along the ceiling of the cave upside down. This time, he remembered that there was a large crack that ran the length of the cave on the ceiling. In his panic, he frantically crawled along the ceiling, breathing hard, hyperventilating, and then all of a sudden, he found it. So he latched onto the crack, crawled along it, and then it started to widen. And then there was light off in the distance. He could see the green glow of light filtering into the cave. So Donald swam frantically to the glow, all the while still panicking, still hyperventilating, and when he reached the opening, his tanks got stuck and they wouldn't go through. And so he was kicking and thrashing and freaking out, but he managed to follow the crack some more, and then his tanks went through. And then there was the opening of the cave. He made it. Upon making it out, the relief was just unbelievable. One second he was writing a goodbye note to his wife and kid, and the next he was going home to see them. As he left the water, he saw that Alex was just sitting there. As it turned out, Alex managed to somehow grab the main line in his panic and just followed it out of the cave. The two of them looked at each other, and Alex said to Donald, "So, we're not diving together anymore, are we?" And Donald would answer back, "Nope, that was it." Donald then grabbed his phone, texted his wife, and said,
Hey, watch
"Had a
it.
bit of a scary moment today, but I'm coming home." If you made it this far, I just want to thank you for watching. I made this video and have wanted to make this video for a long time due to pop.
This blanket won't stay on my legs, dog. Oh!
Get that out of here. I don't want your body in our house. Or this bathroom.
What are you playing? Like, what map is that? What map are you playing on?
What map? It's ruins. Yes, please. Huh.
Have you been plugging that in?
What?
Have you been plugging that in?
Yeah. Yeah, who shot on the top? It's falling everywhere.
You know, I'm gonna go to the pool now.
Okay.
Let's see. I think they close at 4. Yeah, I'm gonna stop streaming anyway. Bye.